Srila Prabhupada's purport. If a butter pot and fire are kept together, the butter within the pot will certainly melt. Woman is compared to fire, and man is compared to a butter pot. However advanced one may be in restraining the senses, it is almost impossible for a man to keep himself controlled in the presence of a woman, even if she is his own daughter, mother, or sister. Indeed, his mind is agitated even if one is in the renounced order of life. Therefore, Vedic civilization carefully restricts mingling between men and women. If one cannot understand the basic principle of restraining association between man and woman, he is to be considered an animal. That is the purport of this verse. Hare Krishna. So here we get some very practical, basic understanding for how society can operate in a spiritual fashion. It is, as Prabhupada explained in a previous purport, actually the previous one, Prabhupada put it that in Kali Yuga, people are extremely liberal, but mixing with women and talking with them as equals actually constitutes an uncivilized way of life. So we get to understand something very important when we start to practice Krishna consciousness, that we require to get back control of our senses. And there is a great struggle in this world to control the senses and keep them focused on the business in hand. And what is that business in hand? Having come to the human form of life, we can understand that the real business of the human form of life is self-realization, is understanding our spiritual identity. That is the topmost priority for the human being. Actually, atato brahma jigyasa, that the human life, now we've got this, it's time to inquire about the absolute truth. It's time for making inquiries into our spiritual realization. And of course, when we make inquiries, we have to listen to the answer also. So these things go forward, that we should come to understand that everyone in this material world, every one of us, is entangled in this material conception of life. And when we look at what the supreme goal is, that is to develop our eternal relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we need to see that there is a supreme goal. But if you want to achieve a goal and you want to get there, if you've got a map laid out for you of where you want to go, you have to understand where you are on the map. If you don't understand where you are on the map, if you've ever tried this, if you've tried to find some destination on a map, but you don't know where you are, you've got a real problem. Because how can you understand how to go forward? So, therefore, the Shastras, the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam, particularly guide the living being in spiritual realization. But all the Vedic literatures guide the human beings how to behave in an appropriate way so that they can make progress and progressively advance toward the desired goal of life. So the Vedas offer the opportunity for fulfilling one's desires within the material world, which Sri Narada Muni, who is speaking these verses, actually roundly condemned Srila Vyasadeva for doing. Because, after all, we've been wandering through so many species of life and trying to fulfill our desires one after another after another. The process is described as something like chewing the chewed, trying to satisfy the senses, whichever set of senses we're given in each particular birth, and in this way engaging in pretty much useless activity in the material world. So, the living beings are not the temporary bodies. The living beings are actually the jivas within the bodies. And spiritual realization, unless it takes this into account, so-called spirituality has absolutely no meaning, unless one can understand the basic principle that the personality is nothing to do with this temporary material body. If we don't understand this point, all our claims for so-called being spiritual are totally meaningless. So, the first thing, therefore, Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita is very scientifically, very practically, how we can understand what is the difference between the soul and the body. And it's pretty simple, it's pretty blindingly obvious and straightforward, but we just somehow manage to totally miss it in the material world until we hear from Krishna or Krishna's representative that the soul is the eternal person and that actually we never die and the soul is never destroyed. The personality, this is something in our nature. We naturally think of ourselves as being eternal, except, of course, when we get in some dangerous situation and we find that there is some threat to our existence. And it's a natural state of affairs because we've identified with this temporary body that we've found ourselves in a troublesome situation. So having accepted this temporary material body, we have to understand that the identification with the material body goes very deep, actually extremely deep. And here in this verse, Prabhupada explains that the nature of the identification, or rather the misidentification with this temporary body, is so strong that even someone who's taken up the renounced order of life struggles with this misidentification and becomes easily victimized by the senses of this material body. These are the simple, realistic facts of life, that what have we got ourselves into? So now, assuming that we're all here for spiritual realization, we need to see what is it going to take to get ourselves from where we are now to go back home, back to Godhead. We're going to have to understand more and more as we go through this science of God. What is the means by which we can actually fix ourselves in Krishna consciousness? And so this is obviously a very famous and a very fundamental verse and purport. This chapter is explaining that in a perfect society you have 4 spiritual classes. Now, on the heavenly planets, you will find that there is plenty of facility for men and women to associate. In this modern society, you will find plenty of facility for men and women to associate. And the principle is for enjoyment. Who can deny it? If you look in this world, we see that the principle on which everyone is working in this world is how to enjoy. The presentation, everywhere you look, is to sell you something. There's so much advertising. And the principle is that if you accept this product or this way of life, then you will actually enjoy yourself. This is the motivating factor in the material world. But unfortunately, it's based on ignorance of the soul. The principle of the motivating factor is that men and women, when they associate, if they associate in the right way, if you have this product or that product, if you have this car or if you have this aftershave, then naturally your enjoyment will increase. That somehow or other the association between man and woman will increase. And therefore the dream of real satisfaction and pleasure will become the reality. But it is only a dream. This is the sad fact of life in the material world. It's only a dream. And we're caught up in this very strongly binding dream that through material association we're going to become satisfied. So why is this dream so powerful? That it is keeping us entangled all the time. The dream is, the reason it's so powerful is that it's based on reality. It's so much based on reality that it can be mistaken for reality. Unless one has better information, unless you can see what's going on behind the scenes. So therefore, Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is explaining that we need to understand the nature of this world, and we need to understand the nature of this world in relation to the spiritual world. That the reflected tree that you see in the river or the lake, what appears to be the pinnacle of enjoyment in this world is actually at the bottom. It's at the bottom of the heap. In the material world, the idea of sense enjoyment or relation ultimately between man and woman in sensual connection is actually in the spiritual world, it's at the top of the tree. But in the material world, it's actually the other way up. If you look at that reflection of the real tree, then you find that actually everything is completely topsy-turvy. In the material world, the connection between man and woman, which is intended for keeping the living entity bound up birth after birth, is really the pits when it comes to developing spiritual life. It's what continues and reinforces and shackles the living entity into the materialistic conception of life, into being cheated of his spiritual identity. But actually that it appears so real because it's based on the reality of actual existence. We sing this song, Jaya Radha Madhava. What are we singing? We're actually singing about the glories of the relationship between the supreme male and the supreme female. But this should not be mistaken for the nature of the material world, because actually that relationship is the supreme perfection of life. In Vrindavan, Krishna's abode, that relationship is the real relationship. That is the topmost, sweetest nectar. And here in the material world, when we agitate the mind by considering the affairs between men and women in this material world, the senses become distracted and we deepen the agitation that keeps us bound up in the bodily conception of life. We keep ourselves disturbed from clarity, from clear thinking, from clear consciousness that actually our relationship lies with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this principle is very nicely presented in this verse of how it actually works in the material world. That woman is compared to fire and man is compared to a butter pot. It's a very simple, straightforward, obvious thing. But until we actually hear this scientific understanding about what's going on and what's entangling us in the material world, it remains blindingly unobvious, literally. And so we struggle. So therefore in spiritual life, when there are 4 spiritual classes in society, as is being discussed here by Narada Muni, we see that there is a progression, and that having gotten the human form of life, that it begins with the brahmachari order. And so Narada Muni is discussing all these points to help us understand how the brahmachari life progresses, and that it is not absolutely necessary for the brahmachari to go on to householder life. That is not a requirement. It is many times the case, but as we see by studying these chapters, we see that the brahmachari, one who's actually in the brahmacharya ashram, can go on to also straight on to vanaprastha life, because the brahmachari can continue without becoming distracted also in household life. And that the brahmachari can also go straight on to sannyas life. The whole point is that to stay in ashram is not that grihastha ashram is a bad ashram, because these principles are there in all the ashrams. These principles remain good in all the ashrams. Because, after all, just because someone is a householder doesn't mean that they become transcendental. Maybe just the opposite. Actually, maybe by that association, their consciousness is much more accustomed to being disturbed by having the male-female association. But it doesn't necessarily mean that also. Because one who's actually in ashram, whatever ashram it be, whether it brahmacharya or grihastha or vanaprastha or sannyas, the principle is that the focus is on spiritual life. The focus is on Krishna. And when the focus is on Krishna and understanding what is my relationship with Krishna, then the principles become servants of the devotee, actually. They become our assistants. They help us progress throughout our whole career. We may call it a career in the material world. Actually, everyone is careering here and there, being dragged by the senses. But the principle is that our career is our chosen direction in life, what we want to cultivate, what we want to actually achieve in life. So the sense of focus is given when there is ashram in the human society, that the human life means it's a chance for transcendental perfection, a chance to develop our connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So there are many things which are required, and we'll see as we go through these verses in these chapters how Narada Muni is explaining the program for successful human life. Success meaning not that I will have a car or a nice house by the sea or so many different things, but actually the success is to know Krishna, to know what I am, that I'm actually Krishna's servant, and I have no other business in life. But due to ignorance, due to an enormous, overwhelming tide, overflooding of misinformation, we've come to accept in human society so many nonsense values of life that keep us steeped in ignorance and the practical impossibility to practice spiritual life. This is the situation of the society we find ourselves in. And therefore it's like an uphill struggle to preach. It's hard work. Because people are generally not very interested. They think the Haris are a bunch of weirdos. How to actually help people understand the real principles and practices of spiritual life. It requires becoming sober. And this simple guidance here about, therefore, a man should avoid associating even with his own daughter in a secluded place, and similarly, he should also avoid association with other women, and that one should associate with women only for important business and not otherwise, is to help the living being remain sober so he can focus on spiritual life instead of being carried away. And we can all appreciate that the whole world is carried away by this principle of male-female enjoyment in the material world. Everywhere you look, everywhere you hear, the songs that you hear, the words that you read in the newspaper, whatever you see on the television, it is based on the principle that the living entity should be very firmly identify with his temporary body and forget about Krishna. Actually, the propaganda is so overwhelming. So this is actually our situation in the material world. And this is how we have to understand what is our position in Krishna consciousness. What is actually the difficulty of this situation. But it requires a cool head. And it requires to therefore decrease the fever of agitation in the material world. We actually have to reduce the fever. So unless people are in this fever pitch of material enjoyment, then how do people function in this material world? It's what keeps people going, that there's some hope that I will enjoy this material world. There's some hope that this world will make me happy. Otherwise, you might as well commit suicide. Because after all, if you can't become happy in this world, why carry on beating yourself up, beating your head against a brick wall, working so hard day and night, frothing at the mouth, to try and perpetuate the myth of material enjoyment? What's the point? People sometimes ask, what is the point of it all? Unfortunately, when you try to tell them the answer, they say, no, I don't want to hear that sort of stuff. This is too much. You know. The living entity is so conditioned. It's very hard to understand Krishna. But when we understand that the urge for enjoyment in the material world is based on the urge to enjoy, which is the natural tendency of the living being. Prabhupada calls it the spiritual sex urge. That spiritual sex urge is to actually have a relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That is the inner pushing of the living being. But because we don't know the means by which we can satisfy that urge, because we're not experienced in that, because we've forgotten our relationship with Krishna, this urge is expressed in a perverted way in the material world. But the natural tendency of the living being is to enjoy. But what is the means by which the living entity enjoys? We see that in Vrindavan, the living entities, they enjoy by always being absorbed in thought of Radha and Krishna. Shri Shri Radha Gokulananda ki jai. Vishnu Padaya Krishna Padaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pachari Seshani Hari Pastyatadesh. Why is the Krishna book such an important book? It actually shows how the living entities become happy. It's very practical. It's the practical demonstration that the living entity becomes happy by using all their senses, their whole consciousness, in satisfying Krishna's senses. And this way, the living beings actually enjoy their senses. This way we actually enjoy. And just like every one of us, when we practice Krishna consciousness, we experience some satisfaction. Otherwise, why would we carry on? We need to not only experience it, but we also need to understand what's going on. That when our senses are engaged in the satisfaction of Krishna's senses, then we feel satisfaction. But when we try to independently satisfy the senses without trying to satisfy Krishna, then actually this only leads to frustration and ignorance and misery. But we all have the experience that when we engage in devotional service to Krishna, then we actually feel good. We may or may not understand it, but these books that Prabhupada is giving us, this transcendental knowledge that's coming down through this whole disciplic succession, from Krishna to Brahma to Narada Muni to Vyasadeva, coming all the way down in disciplic succession. This knowledge is to help us understand what's actually going on. That the science part of it is that when our senses are simply engaged in the service of Krishna and pleasing Krishna, then our senses experience pleasure. This is the real nature of the urge of the living being to become satisfied in a loving relationship. And without that relationship being centered on Krishna, then we only experience material existence. But in the spiritual world, everyone is really enjoying because the center is Krishna. Everyone is actually satisfied to love Krishna, think of Krishna, be absorbed in Krishna, and their sole purpose of existence is to satisfy Krishna. Therefore, the senses actually enjoy. So we see the inhabitants of Vrindavan, the cowherd boys, his mother and father, Nanda and Yasoda, Yasoda and Nanda, the gopis, the cows, all the creatures of Vrindavan. They're actually transcendentally satisfied. They've achieved the goal of life because they realize practically that the loving relationship is with Krishna, with Radha Krishna. Satisfying Krishna is the real platform of happiness. But in the material world, we're experiencing it in a perverted way, only the reflection of happiness. And so it never actually satisfies the heart, never actually satisfies the soul. So we should know why devotional service is so sweet. We should know why chanting the holy names of Krishna is so sweet. We should know the science. We have to live by the science, practice the science, understand the science. And the more we practice Krishna consciousness, as Krishna has advised us, manmana bhava madbhakta, madhyaji mam namaskaru. Krishna is saying, always think of me, become my devotee, and worship me, and offer your homage to me. And in this way, surely you will come to me. Krishna is making this promise, although we may not believe him, that actually he's a very dear friend, and that we're guaranteed to go back to him if we follow this. But we should not be foolish. We should know what we're doing, why we're doing it, how to do it, and do it. And that way we'll make nice progress in our spiritual life. And the more we understand it, and particularly we should know that the pleasure that we're talking about, giving pleasure to Krishna, means helping the other living entities in this material world also come home back to Krishna. This is called Sankirtan. Actually chanting the holy names, congregational chanting of the holy names, explaining about Krishna to others. Practical. Helping other living beings come closer to Krishna and also develop their relationship, because this is what will satisfy Krishna. He's expressed this at the end of Bhagavad Gita, that what is in my heart, what is so dear to my heart, is when someone explains this science of devotional service to the other living beings. And that way we can understand, just like the devotees, why the devotees who are trying to preach are the most fired up, because they're actually absorbed in getting that taste of satisfying Krishna's senses. And so they get so much taste from chanting and performing Sankirtan Yajna and distributing Prabhupada's books, distributing these books all about Krishna. Why they are so excited and enlivened? Because the senses are actually engaged in pleasing Krishna. And the more we become conscious of that, the more we benefit. So, before we go on to some questions and discussion more, we should know that these books that Prabhupada is giving us are very, very important. We should know that the Sankirtan Yajna is our business because it pleases Krishna. This is the Sankirtan movement. So when I was in Govardhan and Vrindavan just in November, Giriraj Maharaj, he explained something very helpful to us. He explains Prabhupada had given us a very simple, practical understanding of how to progress. He said that performance of Sankirtan Yajna will keep the devotees happy, and reading my books will keep them. So we need to keep happy, and we need to keep in Krishna consciousness. So we need to practice Krishna consciousness and understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that will make our lives successful and enable us to also continue very nicely without being bewildered in Krishna consciousness. So the word here is pramada. Pramada is described here, is translated here as the woman, one who bewilders the mind of a man. And pramada also means madness. That is the madness of the material world. Everyone is living in this madness condition of life, thinking that by carrying on in this same propaganda that we've been fed through countless generations, and we are fed very strongly by materialistic society, that association between man and women a woman will make us happy. Actually, pramada, it's madness. Because it's keeping us in bewilderment. It's keeping us in a bewildered frame of mind where we cannot understand what is actually good for us. So Bhagavatam is meant for helping us realize Krishna. So step by step we're studying these books and gradually coming to appreciate how Prabhupada is guiding us back home, back to Godhead. Hare Krishna.